I just wanted to put a seizure warning at the start of this video. I don't know whether gameplay footage of Rage has any increased probability of triggering seizures in people, but there are a lot of flashing lights, contrasting colors, screen distortion effects, things like that. And as someone who used to suffer from seizures, I don't want to accidentally give them to anybody else. So this may not be a required seizure warning, but here it is all the same, just to be safe.
So I was wondering this all day, but what is it with AAA games and Magenta these days?
You know, we didn't even know that pink was in the color wheel until Rage 2.
Rage 2 is what would happen if, in a world populated by anthropomorphized video games, 2015's Mad Max and Crysis had a little baby. But they both died, and the baby was then raised by Far Cry and Doom 2016. But their relationship was strained by the introduction of a newborn game, and they ended up resenting and neglecting the child, resulting in it growing up to regularly act like a twat for attention when all it really needed was to be listened to and have some time spent with it. While that's an unfunny example of a metaphor people often use to try and describe new games, the truth is that arguably Rage 2 is the result of a sensual evening between Doom 2016 and Just Cause 3. Rage is an id Software property, but it was Avalanche Studios, the Swedish development house responsible for the Just Cause series, who led the development on this sequel. Apparently the two studios had wanted to work together on a project for several years, though Rage 2 was the only title that had any serious discussions about it. Annoyingly, the only information I've managed to find regarding the making of this game comes from pre-release promotional materials and interviews, so everybody loves everyone else and they're all having just the best time, you guys, and it's big smiles all around. Apparently both studios planned on working together on another project after Rage 2, so I imagine this possibility is why we haven't seen any sort of expose detailing publisher deals or anything like that. Apparently it was Bethesda Vice President Pete Hines in 2016 who first publicly hinted at a possible sequel to Rage. Now, this could have been a case of id Software and Avalanche Studios coming to Bethesda with the idea for Rage 2 and being given the green light. Or it could have been Bethesda higher-ups thinking that there might still be some money in a banana stack Rage IP and demanded that the two studios work together. Am I pulling this out of my arse just to create the suggestion of behind-the-scenes drama? Arguably yes, but I'm a cynical bastard, and the idea that a major publisher would let a couple of huge development studios work together on a passion project is certainly a rarity, and would be a pleasant surprise in this industry dominated by games designed to suck as much money as they can from vulnerable people for the least possible effort. I won't talk about the original Rage too much, as I blathered on about it for nearly 45 minutes in my last video, but it was intended to be id Software's first open world shooter with some vehicular combat thrown in for good measure. They didn't quite achieve that, and instead created what I consider to be a very solid first-person shooter with levels separated by large corridors that you drive along in floaty vehicles. Again, there doesn't seem to be much out there regarding the failings of Rage, about what sacrifices they had to make to get the game released, but the brief mentions of it in the Rage 2 promotional material just mentions that their vision was limited by the technology at the time. Which is funny, because before that game came out, most of the conversation was about the new technologies being developed specifically for it. So the narrative we've been provided with is that id Software were impressed by the open world aspects of the Just Cause and Mad Max games created by Avalanche, and Avalanche have huge respect for id Software and are big fans of their shooters. And after years of talking about it, they finally pooled their resources to make a game together. But again, not really. From what I can tell, Avalanche did all of the work on this. They did the coding, the art, the sound, everything over in Stockholm. By the sounds of it, id Software were just on the end of the phone, giving them pointers on how to make the guns feel good, and then taking credit for the game in interviews.
And Avalanche, they are the developer. We have people at id that have helped work with the team, but they're the ones doing the bulk of the work.
What is id's biggest sort of contribution, would you say, to this?
Just the id style combat, the movement as offense and defense, getting you into the action, rewarding you for using your abilities, heavy, meaty situational weapons. Like when you play it, you're like, oh, this feels like an in-game, but it exists in this emergent kind of system-driven world. So it's really the best of both things.
And it's that detail that makes me wonder if Bethesda didn't actually force this partnership. The limited open world and the driving were arguably the worst aspects of the first Rage, while Avalanche have a proven track record of succeeding with these aspects, but they've never put together a decent shooter. Smush those two together and see what they come up with. For many people, the motivation behind any video game project doesn't really matter, but after finding out that the only reason Skull and Bones wasn't scrapped long ago was likely just to satisfy a deal made between Ubisoft and the government of Singapore has only added fuel to the already raging cynical fire that is my brain space, and this sort of thing just matters to me. But, just like your parents, they are sticking with the story that they always wanted to get together and make this, and they are very proud of how it turned out. I don't think anyone ever really expected a sequel to Rage, though the ending certainly felt like it happened one act too early. And again, just like you, that didn't turn out how the creators had hoped, and I can certainly understand the desire to try again to do it better this time, which is why you have a younger sibling. Rage the First ended with protagonist Nicholas Rain infiltrating what I assume to be the headquarters of the Authority, a group of baddies that want to control the remains of, I think, the world, but maybe just North America. I'm not sure, it's not made clear. Anyway, Little Nicky activates a satellite which triggers the release of every Ark on the planet. Prior to the big asteroid hitting the Earth, several people were stuffed into stasis and buried underground in these Arks, due to emerge when it was safe to do so and then start rebuilding society. If I remember correctly, the Authority gained the ability to control when Arks emerged and only did so every time they wanted some new tech. I think. I'm not sure whether I did hear that in the first game or whether I've just pulled something else out of my arse. We've just moved house and I haven't changed doctors yet, but this discharge of unsubstantiated claims is starting to worry me. We were also told in the first game that people from the Arks are special, and they always seem to join the resistance against the Authority, so having unearthed all of the Arks at once, we now have an army to fight back against the Authority and free the wastelands. Sounds like a great setup for a new game, but no, this is actually the backstory for Rage 2. The Resistance won, overthrowing the Authority and sending them running off underground. Or at least, that's what the Authority wanted them to think. They retreated underground and let humanity relax a bit, watching as humans started turning on each other and became a bunch of overly annoying people who crave attention and think they're funny and edgy all the time. Rage 2 opens with General Cross, a character only mentioned in the last game as the leader of the Authority, giving a nice speech to his army of mechanically enhanced mutants before launching an attack on the compound of Vineland, ironically named as there isn't much greenery at all. We play as Walker, who doesn't have a first name because you can choose to be either male or female, and they obviously didn't want to make everyone else record any extra dialogue to accommodate this choice. The only difference this makes is the sound of the voice that does your talking, but my instinct when starting the game was that we were choosing between two siblings, with the one we didn't select maybe becoming a supporting character for the rest of the game. So I was quite surprised 2 seconds later when the door explodes open and instantly wipes them out. Our basically but not technically stepsister makes her presence known and tells you to come help repel the attack. I take a moment to mourn who I had assumed to be my sister and then mosey outside for a good old-fashioned action-packed game introduction. And I will be quickly running through the story now, so I guess this is a spoiler warning, though this game continues the precedent set by the last one by not having much of a story anyway, and there's no real twists or surprises or anything dramatic like that. The Authority forces are made up of different variations of those augmented mutants that turned up in the last level of the first game, and these represent the Authority military presence for most of this one. There's an element of body horror to the mutants in Rage 2, which I personally quite appreciated, especially compared to the last game where they just look like the offspring of Gollum and Sloth. You fight your way through the besieged settlement, blasting your way through the mutant forces of the Authority. We start off with just a pistol and the traditional wing stick, but soon get access to an assault rifle and grenades. I'll go into the weapons in more detail later on, but while I found the pistol to be initially a bit unsatisfactory and frankly a bit limp, the assault rifle feels like it's going to rip through the crust of the earth itself, and I'd regularly use it late into the game regardless of how effective it actually was, just because of how good it feels to shoot. Along the way, we are introduced to an ultimate badass who is here to protect us all, and he then instantly gets his head bitten off by a giant gribbly. So the big decapitated hero clearly has no need for his super awesome suit anymore, and being the closest person to it, we invoke the rule of finders keepers and put it on. Remember in my Rage video where I mentioned that John Goodman tells us how ARC people are special, but this is never really elaborated on? Well, it turns out that this little bit of the intro cutscene for that game actually shows people being injected with nanotrites, which, for an easy comparison, are basically nanomachines, son! And these are the excuse for giving us superpowers, which this suit we just stole from this chap can use to enhance our combat abilities. We don't have access to all of these abilities yet, but for now we can activate an overdrive ability after killing enough mutants, which buffs our gun to let us dish out extra damage, and I think lets us take less damage from enemies for a short period of time. We eventually make our way to another character who we are introduced to shortly before she gets killed. We are playing as an orphan, and this woman called Prowley raised us as our own, and is Lily's mother. That's enough character development for her though, as she gets killed by General Cross, who is just a human head mounted onto a mech, who then saunters off with all his forces, leaving very few survivors. Walker and Lily figure out that our newly acquired Ranger suit will give us access to the Arcs, which contain hidden technologies that could help them rebuild and fight back against the Authority. Upon entering the Vineland Arc, we see a hologram of Prowley telling us that she prevented us from becoming a Ranger all these years so that we wouldn't be targeted when the Authority inevitably came a-calling. She then tells you that at the end of the Authority Wars, her and 3 characters from the first game came together to work on Project Dagger, something that would stop the Authority from ever returning, which was especially concerning as they believed General Cross to have found a way to live forever. They then stopped working on the project for some reason which isn't properly explained, but they all stayed in touch through LinkedIn or whatever over the years, and she tasks you with finding these 3 people and getting the band back together to kill General Cross permanently and stop the Authority once and for all. And that's the story. You do just that. You meet each of these 3 people, do 2 missions for each of them to help them get their part of the Dagger project ready, and then go and stop the Authority. No twists, no turns, no surprise reveals. There is an encounter with General Cross during one of the missions where he reveals his secret to eternal life, but as we've already been told that he can live forever and he's just a head on an elaborate and complicated shelf, coupled with the objective for this mission being to retrieve some of his DNA, it was hardly a surprise to learn that he's been cloning himself. There is something of a cliffhanger at the end of all this. No, actually, cliffhanger makes it sound more impressive than it really is. We nearly die in the final confrontation after General Cross employs some Duke Leto breathing tactics on us, and Dr. Kvasir, the doctor chap with the robot version of Wade Duck's rubber ring head thing, revives us and says that if we can be revived, so too could General Cross. Dun dun dun! And that's it. We're thrown back into the world to carry on doing any side activities we missed. We at least get a proper boss fight at the end of this one though, so it was at least more satisfying ending. But narratively, we weren't taken on any rides or left questioning our own existence or politics or anything like that. The big bad robot man wants to kill us all, so we killed him first. Or did we? Buy Rage 3 to find out, except I doubt that would ever happen, as apparently this sold less copies than the first game, which is a shame because I would argue that in many ways this game is superior to the first, though as with anything worth talking about, there are some caveats to that statement. I would argue that the biggest difference between these 2 games is the style of shooting. When you boil it down to its core mechanics, Rage 1 is much more of an old school shooter. You move forward down a corridor and stuff comes at you. Sometimes they take cover or try to flush you out with grenades, but you either take cover yourself and pop out with some headshots, or you charge in with a shotgun and blast their eyeballs apart. Rage 2 features many open environments for you to fight in, and one thing that took me several hours to realise is that most of the time you approach enemy groups, they are unaware of you. This lets you have a look around and plan your strategy before launching your assault. While you are given viable equipment to keep your distance and take out enemies at range, this game does seem to feel like it's encouraging you to get more up close and personal in your fights, taking a leaf out of Doom 2016's push forward combat style. All of this to say that the combat is very different between these 2 games, and as someone who grew up with the older style shooters, it tends to take me a little bit longer to get to grips with the more frenetic style of games like Rage 2. And while I did get my head around it and started to really enjoy it, I do think that the openness of the game greatly affected my approach to the combat, and by that I'm not talking about the open environments. I mentioned those arcs earlier, and that our ranger suit allows us to access these and whatever technology lies within. There are 14 in total, and they may contain either new suit abilities or new weapons. You are technically free to wander around and discover these for yourself. I mean, the world is completely open to you once you complete the 20 or 30 minute tutorial, and this is almost encouraged by the developers. Unfortunately for me, it was only about an hour before I completed the whole game that I realised that when using your temporary detective vision in the outside world, you can actually see big sky beams highlighting arc locations. I don't remember the game telling me that, so this may be on me, but this means you could hypothetically run around and unlock all of these abilities and weapons right at the start of the game. The main thing stopping you from doing this is the enemy difficulty, which varies between areas. Each map location you discover, whether it be a bandit camp, a road gate, an authority sentry, or pretty much anything else, will come with a little number out of 10 signifying the strength of the enemies hanging out there. It doesn't tell you how powerful you are in comparison though, so you just have to figure out whether you're comfortable taking on a level 6 area based on how quickly you mopped up those level 4 scrubs earlier. The thing is, you can't access these arcs until the area around them is clear of enemies, and while I'm sure there are some elite badasses that can clear each area right from the get-go, I am not one of those people. And like I said, I didn't realise until the end of the game that you can follow a giant light beam in the sky to find them, so I was relying on finding arcs either as part of story missions or by talking to every NPC with a speech bubble over their head in every town, hoping that they would tell me where an arc is. And this is what I fear has skewed my perception of the combat in this game. The first arc gives you a dash ability, and the next 3 I found gave me a shotgun and the ability to force push people at close range and to perform a ground slam attack. The next few arcs I found gave me less offensive abilities, like the defibrillator, which was given to us at the start of the last game, and so it's a bit odd that we need to unlock it here, some sort of extra sprint ability and a double jump. And this was all I had for what turned out to be the majority of my playthrough. These were from arcs I picked up from main story missions and NPCs who I just happened to walk past and take quests from, but after a few hours of not getting anything new, I then started going out of my way to find quests that would lead me to new arcs. I eventually got a rocket launcher, which makes short work out of tougher enemies, and then a revolver which has triggered exploding rounds, which I didn't find too useful really, and that was kind of it, right up until the end of my playthrough. Because of this, I found myself inadvertently geared towards short-range combat. I had my combat shotgun, which I will be gushing about for a minute or so later on, and I had my force push and ground and pound abilities. So getting right up into the face of enemies seemed like the best tactic given the gear I had available. It was after being told that I was now ready to launch my final assault on the authority that I purposely went out of my way to uncover every remaining arc to see what other powers and weapons I'd been missing out on all this time. Luckily, each arc does require a big fight to get into and then another big fight to get out of again, and one of them required 2 other little dungeons to be completed before accessing it, so you do get a good opportunity to experiment with whatever new toys you find inside them. There's a barrier ability, which I found useful when tactically retreating, not running away, down corridors from a group of enemies. A vortex ability, which pulls in everything around it before exploding, which you can use like the old school rocket jumps from Quake. And there are 3 other weapons to find, one being a sniper rifle, which I've been wishing for throughout most of the game, a minigun, which is actually more effective as it heats up, and a nail gun, which can pull enemies towards a piece of scenery. Again, I'll talk more about the weapons and such later on, but just by looking at that list, I can remember times in my playthrough where I really could have done with a deployable shield and a minigun, or being able to sit back with a sniper rifle and pick people off while 2 other factions fought amongst themselves. What this means is that to get the most out of this fast, frenetic combat shown off in the trailers and review videos, you need to put the work in and unlock all of your toys first. I mentioned in my Rage video about how I wasn't really enjoying the combat until I had unlocked a good range of weapons, and while I did enjoy the combat more from the get-go here, the short time I had to play with everything made me realise how much more varied combat options I had, which maybe would have made it more enticing for me to scavenge through yet another bandit camp looking for crystals and scrap. Personally, I think it would have been better if you had all of your suit abilities active from the start, and then the arcs contained upgrades for them, because I found the existing upgrade system to be a bit of a faff, and it means you would be able to play around with your new powers, figure out which ones you prefer, and upgrade them as you go. New weapons could have been dished out to you as you meet each of the 3 main characters, and they could have put upgrades for these in the arcs as well. But for now, let's talk upgrades, because there is plenty for you to upgrade here. You can upgrade your weapons, your suit powers, some general abilities, and your vehicle all through the menu system at any point. The main currency for upgrading is Feltrite, a blue crystal which can be found by the boxful in enemy bases. You can pull it out of the walls in some places, and it occasionally falls from the sky in meteorites. Picking it up also gives you some health too, so it's handy to keep an eye out for this. Enemies occasionally drop it as well, which again help reinforce that push forward combat approach I'd inadvertently railroaded myself into. Feltrite alone is enough to upgrade your suit abilities, like being able to double jump further or get more health back when using your defibrillator. Weapons require Feltrite to unlock a new weapon mod slot, and you'll need weapon mods to unlock one of 2 upgrades per level. You can swap these out at any time. Ooh, Archetim, do it any time. You can swap these out at any time, but you can only have 1 at each level equipped at once. More general abilities like lowering crafting requirements or displaying an arc when throwing a grenade are unlocked through projects. Each of the 3 members of Project Dagger have their own projects to unlock, and you earn project points by completing different types of activities, like unlocking arcs or clearing mutant nests. Project points can be used across all 3 categories of unlocks though, and while some do grant you useful abilities like being able to target lock your wing stick or melee grenades back to enemies, many of them are just incremental upgrades like 10% more special ammo capacity or something uninteresting like that. Finally, there's motor parts to upgrade your vehicle, and while limited amounts of these can be purchased in garages, the best source of them is completing convoy missions, but I'll come back to those later on. Instead, I want to highlight another failing on my part, which I will attempt to blame the game design for. There are 3 large settlements across the wasteland that you can visit, with 2 of them being fairly sprawling environments full of little alleyways and neon signs. In one of these towns is a doctor's shop. Not to be confused with other medical supply shops that sell you health kits. No, this doctor, and only this doctor, will sell you items that permanently increase your maximum health or increase your damage resistance and increase your weapon damage output. The thing is that I didn't realise this until about 8 hours into my 12 or so hour playthrough. Maybe I should have stopped to talk to this merchant, but after I just listened to a barman talk about a dead friend of his for several minutes and then a butcher list off all the different products he sells that the game won't let me buy, I wasn't in the mood to talk to any more NPCs, at least not until I was desperately searching for ARC locations. I feel like these types of upgrades would make perfect sense to be included in my suitability list, rather than from one shop off the main road in one specific town. Honestly, the whole upgrade system became a bit of a faff for me, and I felt like none of them were particularly exciting. But if you don't at least upgrade your weapons, then you'll have a much harder time when the armoured enemies start turning up. Luckily, when you are in combat and not worrying about what to spend your little blue crystals on, the game absolutely shines. I put a seizure warning at the start of this video because the combat throws all sorts of flashing lights, contrasting colours and distorted visual effects that I was worried about my seizures making a comeback 20 years after I thought I'd seen the last of them. Combat arenas are littered with exploding barrels. There is almost always several levels of verticality to take advantage of. Projectiles and drones litter the air. I've already said it, but this really is fast and frantic. Something else I said earlier was that most of the time you can approach combat encounters on your terms. Enemies will either be minding their own business or already fighting someone else as you approach. One thing I really like in this game is that in quieter moments out in the wastelands, you'll sometimes hear the faint sound of gunfire in the distance, and you can see tracer rounds shooting across the sky. The good thing is that they won't all suddenly turn to attack you as soon as you get involved. I started taking out one group that I'd managed to get behind, and they barely seemed to notice me, likely because they were all focused on the death squad bearing down on them from the other side. Again, my experience with the combat is tainted by me having not unlocked half the weapons until the end of the game, so I was very much focused on getting up close and personal with these bandits. I found the game to be very clear on what sort of damage you are doing without creating too much clutter in the HUD. When you hit an enemy, a red reticule will appear. Unless they're wearing armor, then it will be yellow. When an enemy dies, a skull icon will appear in said reticle, which is handy as the screen can get very busy with explosions, smoke, blood and debris littering the area. Headshots are tricky because enemies don't often sit still, but they will result in a lovely squishy sound and an eruption of giblets from their neck stop. Armoured enemies will lose any armour you can sustain fire on, but only in that area, so shooting the armour off their chest won't have any effect on the helmet protecting their bonds. Then there's the enemies like the augmented mutants that usually have their backs covered in a metal framework, so you'll have to put yourself in their line of fire to do any proper damage, or use a rocket launcher, whatever. Later in the game, those armoured authority troops we mowed down by the Legion in the last game turn up, except these guys are much tougher this time around. They have shields which need to be depleted first, and if you don't take them out quick enough, their shield will recharge and you'll have to do it all again. They come at you with a mix of ranged attacks and dashing straight at you, so building your dash ability into your repertoire is a must. Another improvement in Rage 2 is the boss fights, of which the number has arguably tripled in this game. Though if you play that game or watch my video on it, you'll remember that there's only one boss fight, so we get 3 here and one is arguably a mini boss because the exact same enemy appears several times throughout the game. So really we have 2 unique boss fights, but they're both against the same person. There's also giant mutant mini-bosses scattered around the world. Some of them could be at the end of dungeons, others I just found while I was out and about. And there's one quest which has you kill this giant sandworm in the desert, but I hate that so much I'll be coming back to it later. And I've just noticed how often I say I'll come back to something later. Maybe I should learn how proper writing structure works or something. So we get 2 boss fights with General Cross, both of which boil down to doing damage until they take a rest and then fight off a couple of waves of enemies, rinse and repeat, and to some degree involve hitting glowing weak points. Again, these are fine and a big step up from the 1 boss fight from the last game. The repeating mini-boss was a bit of a challenge at first, until I unlocked the rocket launcher, at which point it became trivial. This big chappy has a glowing plate on his chest. Shoot it enough times and 2 pistons will emerge on his back. Shoot them until they explode and his thinking cap will fly away, leaving his brain exposed for you to fill with bullets and or rockets. Again, not a bad fight in itself, but it starts happening fairly regularly and it does become trivial once you get better weapons. Even when you only have limited weaponry, it's more of an ammo tax rather than any tactical challenge. You dash out of the way and shoot until you have to dash again. But enough of all that bullshit, let's get down to the real stuff. Let's talk weapons. As mentioned earlier, this is the part of the game that id were apparently most involved with, and that studio, if not every individual working there at the time, are responsible for the biggest names in the genre, so this has got to be good. Most guns have an alternate firing mode, activated by holding down the right mouse button. The pistol fires in bursts from the hip, which again felt a bit limp to me, but aiming down the sights swaps to a single fire mode, which felt a bit more like a revolver and felt a bit more satisfying to me. Next along the keyboard, we have the assault rifle, which again to me felt more like the ED 209 guns from RoboCop. It sounds so hefty and powerful that I had to remind myself several times that I need to upgrade the thing to make it as effective as my senses kept telling me it was. Then we have the shotgun, and this was basically my default weapon throughout most of the game. The fast pace of the fighting here let me keep up a fairly sustained rate of fire with it, and once I upgraded it to reload in a magazine rather than individual rounds, reloading took only a little bit longer than loading another round ready to fire. There became a beautiful deadly rhythm of boom, chuck, chuck, boom, chuck, chuck, boom, chuck, chuck as I dashed and skidded around the battlefield. The alternate fire gives it a bit more range and blasts enemies on their ass or over ledges or into explosives, buying you some time to close the gap without taking as much damage. It's a beautiful weapon, and despite accidentally coming to massively depend on it, I still enjoyed the hell out of combat with this weapon. Next up is the rocket launcher, and this one really made me stop and appreciate the way id Software makes their weapons look. every time you pick up a weapon, whether it be Rage, Doom, and maybe Wolfenstein, I can't quite remember, it's been a while since I played them, your character will take a moment to appreciate the beauty of the weapon they've just acquired. I love the way they all have moving parts and just lots of stuff happening with them. When you aim down the sights of the shotgun, the sides all ripple open along the barrel, and when entering the lock-on feature of the rocket launcher, you see the shell chunk out of the way and something resembling a minigun barrel slams into position. Primary fire with this is a rocket launcher that we all know and love from any other shooter, but the secondary lets you lock onto multiple targets, the amount of which you can upgrade, and then fire a cluster of homing mini rockets at them. Next along the line is the Hyper Cannon, which is the sniper rifle stand-in for this game. You can zoom in and charge up for a more powerful shot, or fire it from the hip for a very powerful and accurate semi-automatic shot. Then we have the Firestorm revolver, which I mentioned earlier, and I found to be fairly useless. Left mouse button fires the rounds, and the right mouse button detonates them and sets the target on fire, doing some minor damage over time. Thing is, this just didn't feel very effective for me, with it taking 3 or 4 detonated rounds to bring down even some of the standard enemies, and with only 6 shots before a relatively lengthy reload animation, you better not miss. Next up is the Grav Dart Launcher, which was the very last weapon I collected, so had the least amount of time to play with. Primary fire rapidly spews out darts, and the secondary fire shoots around, which will attract all of those darts you just fired. Fill an enemy with darts, secondary fire into an explosive barrel meets goon, internal organs, and fire litter the area. You could also pull enemies into walls or off cliffs, or probably some very creative things that I never got a chance to figure out because, again, I discovered this weapon at the very end of my playthrough. Boo. This leaves us with the Pulse Cannon, which I mistakenly thought had unlimited ammo until I ran out. You don't reload this gun, but sustained fire will cause it to overheat, which comes with a lengthy cooldown period. You can cool it down at any point by holding the right mouse button, and you want to keep it in the red on the heat meter to keep up the damage, as it does more damage when it's warmed up compared to when it's cold. It's a very nice weapon, which I compared to the Power Fantasy minigun we got for the last mission of the first game. Again, most of these weapons feel fantastic to use, and the clarity of information during combat allows you to stay informed about what's going on at all times, despite the chaos that's erupting on screen. Except for the little mutants that spit goop on you, sometimes I find myself low on health after not realising they were spitting on me or right up in my backside giving me a good pounding. A bit of screen shake may have made this more obvious, but then again, that probably just gets lost in all the other screen effects going on at any time. There's a consistently good variety of enemy types to deal with, including melee attackers, shooters keeping their distance, projectile enthusiasts, armoured goons, and eventually people with huge shields that charge right at you, and I never quite figured out a decent way of dealing with these guys. Later in the game I started encountering bandits in big mech suits, though these aren't much of a match for a couple of rockets in the midsection. One of the things people remember about the first game is the enemy animations, and while the human enemies are nothing special compared to other more modern games, I feel that the smaller mutant enemies deserve special recognition here. Like in the previous game, these guys will dodge out of the way to get behind you, they'll jump out of the way of your bullets and rockets, they'll bounce off the scenery, and generally be a pain in the ass to shoot, which does make them an intimidating encounter when there's more than one of them, despite their relatively low health. Kind of like mosquitoes, except they're the size of a large 10-year-old and augmented with steel, and they make a less annoying noise. This game generally looks pretty spectacular too, with developers having long realised that games can be more than just several shades of brown. Rage 2 is part of that very brief era when several games featured a lot of magenta and other bright fluorescent colours, with that Far Cry spin-off being another prime example of this. While I've never played that game, I get the impression that it would have the same "oh my god, look at how much I don't care, aren't I crazy and edgy" attitude that this game does. It seems like that sort of thing was becoming an established trend until COVID happened and stopped it all. Silver linings and all that. There's variety to the environments now, so while it is still primarily a desert setting, the northern regions of the map is covered in thick jungle environments, and there's a great big swamp area to the south, which is very reminiscent of the bayou north of Saint-Denis, or I imagine any real world examples of a swamp. I live in the West Midlands, so I've never seen a real one. This new biodiversity in the area is offhandedly explained in the intro cutscene, with the emergence of the Arks also bringing ecopods out of orbit, vast satellites full of seeds to regrow the wildlife on Earth, and the remnants of these pods stand out against the skyline of the wasteland. At the risk of sounding like a pretentious wanker, the world has its moments where it really does feel alive. I mentioned earlier about hearing and seeing gun battles in the distance, but there are also moments where you will hear something breaking the sound barrier and look up to see an authority ship zooming around the skies before awkwardly spawning out of existence in midair right in front of you. Those same ships will pop in as you're driving around to deploy sentry towers or just to blow up bandit cars. Early on, I cleared a bandit road gate, opening it to allow open use of the road once again. As I was crossing to the other side looking for loot, a couple of cars tore through at breakneck speed. The world can still feel empty and like a playground built for you to explore, but there are plenty of moments where it feels like the world is just getting on with things around you and you've just wandered into the middle of it all. Another revelation, and something which is apparently thanks to Avalanche's Apex engine, is the lack of loading times. You could start in the middle of one huge town full of neon lights, chatty NPCs and fire breathers, head out to your car, drive through several different biomes across the wasteland, battling bandits as you go, right into the middle of another similarly populated town to stock up on gear and head out into a dungeon, all without a single loading screen. It's very impressive, and I regularly found myself expecting a loading screen as I entered a mutant nest or whatever, and every time being surprised that nope, I can just walk right on in and carry on with my day. Unfortunately, in the graphics department, the NPCs are not nearly as animated as they were in the last game, which does seem to be something of a trend in big release games over the last few years. Faces more closely resemble Team America than the merchants from the first game, and it's a shame that the environments look so great when the faces of the people you talk to look like they're made out of wood. We also get to revisit Wellspring, one of the main towns from the first game, though there seems to have been some serious erosion taking place here as the landscape outside is slightly different after 30 years. While Wellspring itself is completely different now, apart from the initial square, I did still find myself temporarily lost on my way out, but then remembered the layout from the first game and figured out that actually this alley will lead me back out to that entrance square. The three members of Project Dagger are returning characters from the first game, with Dr. Kvasir being basically exactly the same as before, except with living legs now, leader of the Resistance Marshall, now running a bar in Gunbarrel, and Lusum Hagar is now the mayor of Wellspring after being promoted from Wingstick instructor. Unlike Rage 1, I didn't pick out any recognisable voices from any of the NPCs, and looking through the credits there were no names that I recognised. But the voice acting we get is serviceable for the material, nothing too dreadful, but no standout performances either. So while this is a proper open world now and you can just head off in a straight line, it will ultimately be quicker to get around if you stick to the roads. There is a fast travel option, but only between the three trade towns, and these are not evenly spread out across the map, so at some point you will have to do a bit of driving. I've danced around it long enough, so let's talk about the vehicles here. I haven't played the Mad Max game since about 2016, but I certainly remember it being very good. So with the same developers working on this game, the car combat should be equally great, right? Well, I've not gone through every name in the credits, but the main development roles listed on Wikipedia at least suggest that while this and Mad Max were made by the same studio, it was an entirely different team for both games. Maybe because of this, the vehicles in Rage 2 are, for lack of a better word, meh. You start off with a huge armoured car thing with slightly horny sounding computer.
I'm checking into the clinic. Wait for me. Here I am, Ranger.
Not overtly horny, but she certainly sounds like she's very happy for you to be inside her. This comes with miniguns and can be upgraded to be equipped with homing rockets, 22mm cannons and a mortar. You can also get better armour, a pulse charge to disrupt shields and blast dickheads out of the way, and an ejector seat to launch yourself into combat scenarios. I just wish we could get a slow motion ability when we aim a weapon while in midair. Seems like a bit of a daft omission, to be honest. This vehicle is not as quick or manoeuvrable as the cars in the first game, but you can at least control the camera while driving now. While not as nimble, the thing certainly feels powerful. The sounds of the flippin' jet engine stuck to the back of it as it roars to life make it feel like a minor but noteworthy event, and it looks like nothing short of a cliff face would stop it from moving. When out and about, you can point and shoot your weapons in any direction, but in a very odd design decision, you lose this ability whenever you point in the vague direction of an enemy, be they on foot or in a vehicle. The auto-lock returns from the last game, and while you can get some vague control over what you're aiming at by moving the camera, it very rarely actually targets specifically what you want to kill, and this is a big issue when it comes to attacking convoys. If I remember correctly, that Mad Max game had something similar, where convoys of vehicles roam around waiting for you to wipe them out. The convoys in Rage 2 are made up of a variety of vehicle types with different weapons, usually getting progressively more powerful the closer they are to the front. This stage of the encounters is all fine and dandy, and you get to use your car's shunt ability, which is great at taking out smaller cars and motorbikes. But the big trucks at the head of these convoys have weak spots that you need to take out in order to expose the next weak point, or just to stop them being able to shoot you. Just as often as it automatically targets the thing I want to shoot, it will target the exact wrong thing. I'm not sure why I'd want to target the armoured bulkhead rather than the spot that will take out the machine gun currently filling my chassis with bullets, but sure, let's carry on with this. There are a huge amount of different vehicles you can drive and collect in this game, though unless I missed something, I think you can only upgrade your main car, the Phoenix. You can also take control of tanks, buggies and motorbikes, though I found the latter to handle so badly that I stayed away from them completely. After completing the right missions, you can call in the Xerxes tank whenever you need it, which resembles the Christian Bale Batmobile but on steroids and fires rockets which will take out almost anything in one hit. As you progress, you'll also unlock a flying bike called the Icarus, which has no weapons at all, but if you're just trying to get from A to B, or if you want to keep a lookout for arcs from the sky, this is the best vehicle for the job as no one bothers you while you're up in the air. There are race events you can take part in, whether by challenging random passers-by in the wasteland or by joining televised racing events hosted by one of the most annoying characters in the game.
I can see you got the grit to be great. You got the meat it takes to take the plate. And you got all the trimmings too. Got a contract right here, Prime Cut. You sign that? Well, you sign in blood. You race your way to the top crust like a knife through sirloin, and you emerge victorious and take the gravy too.
How do you do, fellow kids?
You have to do one of these races as part of the story, but only one, and I was so glad because the car they give you handles about as well as the motorbikes. I wish people would just outsource all their driving mechanics to Criterion and we could start getting some burnout level car mechanics in our games. That Mutant Bash TV thing also returns, once again requiring you to go through it at least once for the story. This time it's hosted by a horny older lady and an army of scantily clad, giant head-wearing, assumed sex slaves. This is the same sequence of rooms fighting off waves of mutants until the end as it was last time, and I was left wondering what it is about post-apocalyptic settings having to have some sort of circus-themed death sport. Is Tina Turner and her Thunderdome to blame for all this? So while overall I think the vehicles in Rage 2 are an improvement over the last game, there's still a good deal more they could have done to be more enjoyable. But they are your primary form of transportation and you will need some set of wheels to get around and explore the world. Otherwise you'd never find any of those side activities we talked about. God, that was a strange segue, wasn't it? Remember when I was talking about project points upgrades about like 3 hours ago? You earn these points by completing activities out in the wasteland, which come in all shapes and sizes and can generally be discovered just by exploring. And by exploring, I mean either on your way to driving somewhere else or being told something is out there by an NPC, or by heading to the question marks on your map. I should quickly point out that another thing I do really appreciate and wish other games could incorporate, but maybe in a slightly less intrusive way somehow, is that when you set a destination on the map, the road ahead of you displays a track of arrows guiding you to your destination. Whereas many other games, every Rockstar game, has you keep your eyes glued to a mini-map or radar, this method lets you keep your eyes on the environment that you're exploring, as opposed to following a line on a 2D representation of it. I know the Getaway had a system where the indicators on your car would flash when you needed to turn, but I never played that, and so I can't say how effective that was. But there must be some similar kind of system we can all agree is superior to looking at a map all day long. Anyway, those side activities. These will usually be a group of bandits in an outpost of some sort, but the specific objectives will vary. You might have to blow up all their fuel tanks or open their road barrier. There could be a dungeon full of mutant eggs, which I think contradicts the law that the authorities make mutants, but I'm not sure. Or there could be a giant mutant that needs killing. There could be remains of a dead ranger that you need to identify, or take control of solar power stations, or even just harvesting feltride from a freshly fallen meteor. I never found myself having to go out of my way to do these, as these are excuses for more combat, and I was enjoying the combat enough to willingly engage in more of it, and I was earning a regular supply of project points to spend on upgrades. There are also some unique quests too, like one where I had to search for parts to help build an unlockable mech, which I ended up never using because it moves too slow, or one where you have to head out to the Dune Sea, which isn't on Tatooine, it's actually here, to kill a giant sandworm, but not one of those Dune sandworms, no, something legally different in appearance and function. It is this sandworm and another activity, that being the destruction of authority sentries, which builds off another complaint I had earlier. I do complain a lot about games I apparently like, don't I? When I was talking about those mini-bosses, I mentioned about how they aren't so much of a challenge as they are attacks on my ammunition reserves. The same can be said about the authority sentries and this giant sandworm thing. The sentries can take a lot of damage, and their attacks can almost one-shot you, or at the very least do enough damage to trigger the heartbeat sound effect, which we all know is a bad sign. The best solution I found was to hide behind an indestructible surface and pop out between shots, unloading as many rounds as I could until I had to pop back to cover again. Occasionally they would call down some sort of orbital laser bombardment, but weirdly I found that staying perfectly still usually meant that these missed me completely. That giant worm is a similar problem, except you have to hit specific weak points all over its body, and anything other than your vehicle weapons seem to have no effect on it. The thing then tunnels underground before popping up to one-shot you. I left this in frustration and eventually returned with that Xerxes tank I mentioned before. To my surprise, I ended up killing the thing in 3 hits, which did take more than 3 shots because the auto-aim is shit against moving targets. With knowledge of this all-powerful weapon I had in my hands, I went back to find some of those bastard sentry turrets, only to find that because the Xerxes is technically an authority vehicle, the sentry turrets won't open while you're driving it. I mean, I know this makes sense in the lore of the world, but it pissed me off somewhat. Some side activities require you to kill giant mutants, and these are similarly bullet spongy, and while more powerful weapons do make shorter work of them, this also removes any challenge and again just turns it into an ammo tax. Which leads me to my final point about Rage 2, which could put some people off this game completely, though I was able to power through it and still enjoy the game. Similarly, it might actually make this game appeal to people more. I found the general tone of the game to be pretty annoying. Like I've mentioned throughout this stupidly long video, it feels like every character was neglected by their parents and now they're acting out like little edgelords that don't give a shit and do whatever they want and there's nothing you can do to stop them, but in a way that's been designed by middle-class office workers trying to figure out what cool is. Again, this seemed to be part of a growing trend that it looks like COVID stopped dead, but it permeates throughout the whole game here. The obnoxious colour schemes, the screen distortion effects, the clothes NPCs wear, the guard outside Wellspring judging whether people are dressed cool enough to be let into the town, next to a sign that says "Don't clap back, if you basic, you basic." That kind of talk was outdated before the game even came out, and I should know because I'm always hip and cool and that will never change. I think it's supposed to be funny, and to be fair, we all know that comedy in video games is a difficult thing to get right because it's very subjective, but it just feels like a poor attempt by out-of-touch office types to appeal to a younger market. Maybe younger people really like this aesthetic and tone. I mean, I guess I can see the appeal. The game clearly isn't supposed to be taken seriously. I mean, the reveal trailer had people screaming along to Andrew WK, hardly the type of soundtrack you'd want for a serious exploration of the human condition in extreme environments.
We wanted to have fun, and games are supposed to be fun. And we didn't take ourselves too seriously.
Killing is just something that happens, and they even televise it in this world. You don't have to worry about your murder sprees creating hordes of bandit orphans. There are no children in this world, so strip down to your undies and let's shank some motherfuckers. Within 5 seconds of starting the game, we see our assumed buddy and potential sibling get wiped out with a door, and no one takes a breath to even make note of their death, which arguably sets the tone towards violence for the rest of the experience. This too cool for school tone from the whole game does make the combat feel more impactful though. Look, with the screen shake and the distortion coupled with the harshly bright lights from explosions really makes everything feel impactful, and I can't think of a more satisfying result from a headshot than a nasty squishy noise and an eruption of blood. This is one of those things that could put some people off, or it could be just what others are looking for. For me, I was able to let it wash over me until I got into the combat where it really shines, which thankfully makes up most of my 12 or so hours of playtime. One thing I do like though is that all the NPCs seem to have their own names, and it'll be things like Big Job Buggernuts or Phil McCracken or stuff like that, you know, typical puerile humorous stuff which I got a laugh out of, I'm not ashamed to admit. Apparently the game on release did not have a New Game Plus mode.
There's no New Game Plus because after the main story, you can keep playing. It's already plus.
This is objectively wrong, and every game ever should have a New Game Plus, and I'll fight you if you think otherwise. And just to prove my point, they've added one in since, so I can go back at some point and have a go with those weapons I didn't unlock until the end of the game. There's no multiplayer here, but there is a store. The main menu advertises some DLC, promising new factions and missions and whatever else, so I went to see how much this was on Steam. But here's the thing, you can't buy the DLC separately. You could buy the deluxe edition, which outside of sales costs £15 more than the base game and includes all of the DLC. But if you already have the base game, you have to use microtransactions to buy rage tokens, which you can then exchange for the DLC or some skins for your guns or your vehicles. The advertised DLC costs 1,500 tokens. Can I buy just that many tokens? Can I bollocks and fuck you for asking? Buy a pack of 1,100 and then a pack of 500? Well, I guess I could use the extra 100 tokens in change on some skins or something. No, fuck you, the cheapest items are 350 tokens. This is just stupid, and I thought I'd seen the last of this after finishing all the Assassin's Creed games. I mean, I know Ubisoft pull this shit too, but at least A, they give you some tokens for free so they can get you hooked, and B, they let you buy their DLC outright for cash. Apparently the base game of Rage 2 can go for as little as £7 during a Steam sale. Holy fuck, look how cheap games are in other countries. All those adverts for VPNs should just show you this chart. God, I hate this country. Anyway, if the base game can go for so cheap, one would assume that the deluxe edition might go for around a tenner, maybe, in a deep sale. I'd argue that this base game alone is worth that cost, but then again it is included with Game Pass, at least on PC, and if you're like me and just add every free Epic Game Store game into your library, you may already have it. But it sucks that I'm going to have to pay for tokens that I will never be able to spend, rather than just letting me buy the content outright, because I would like to spend some more time in this world without repeating the same content. I was really hoping to end this massive ramble on a positive note, but it was only after putting together pretty much this entire script that I went back to see if the DLC was cheap enough for me to give a go, and I discovered all of this microtransaction bullshit. I guess the one good thing about it is that it's certainly unobtrusive, being only accessible through the main menu, at least as far as I can tell. But that greedy bullshit aside, I do absolutely recommend this game. I found the combat to be as exciting, engaging, and empowering as Doom 2016. The shooting feels impactful and bombastic, and the combat arenas are littered with enough health pickups and ammo that you could just pick a weapon you like and stick with it, or play around with different tools for different scenarios. The driving is an improvement over the last game, and the convoy missions can be fun when the auto-aim behaves itself, and the story is enough to give you some sort of direction without attempting to get too clever for its britches. We could do with less bullet sponge enemies though. So yes, Go out and buy this game if you don't already have access to it, but I wouldn't recommend buying it at full price. Not unless you have a VPN to change your location to Ukraine or India anyway. Jesus, look at those prices. £35 does seem too much for this in my opinion, as despite it being an open world game with more skill trees than is arguably needed, this is a shorter experience than you might expect. One which took me less than 13 hours to complete the main missions and a whole bunch of side activities. But just because it's short doesn't mean you won't have a damn good time with it, just ask your mum. So thank you for making it this far in the video, which now brings my exploration of the vast Rage series to a close. This hasn't been a ranking series. I mean, I think it's cheeky to call 2 videos a series, but if I were ranking these, I'd put this one above the original, with the caveat that I still think the original is worth your time. Give us a like if you'd be so very kind, and clicking subscribe makes me feel less like I'm rambling into the void with these videos. And it should mean that you get shown my new videos when they are released, but we all know that YouTube doesn't do efficient things like that. It'd rather know what colour scheme you'd like all your videos to adhere to, whatever the fuck that thing was all about. Oh god, I'm going off on one again. I better go and get some dinner. Bye!
Let's move on to the next one.
Okay. We got it.
Here he is. Suckers, let's kill him.